Democracy That Delivers is brought to you by the Center for International Private Enterprise. Now, to your host.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining. I'm Lola Adekonye, Senior Program Officer with the Africa team. Today's podcast is about Kenya's measured progress against crippling corruption. Since 2014, Kenya's private sector has been one of the most proactive about preferring policy and industry solutions to corruption problems. In Kenya, at least SIPE's been working with various private sector organizations over the years in this regard. So today, we're joined by Ben Kiragu, SIPE's country director in Kenya. Ben is an experienced private sector development professional, and he's observed the shifting trends and norms in Kenya's private sector's effort to tackle corruption. So we're excited to jump into this conversation with you, Ben. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Lola, and I'm glad to be here.
Great. Thanks, Ben. So, we can just jump right into it because it's an exciting time in Kenya right now with the elections on the horizon. There's a lot going on, and observation is often that once you are a few months to elections, to general elections especially, reform efforts sort of grind to a halt because you almost know that election sucks up all the air and there's almost nothing that can be done in terms of advocacy or civic engagement in pushing for some of the anti-corruption reforms that have been on the front burner for a while. But I think there are also opportunities. Do you have some observations about, what the opportunities are and what reforms might be the ones that might, get traction after elections?
So you're right. Kenya goes into its next elections on August 9th, later this year. And the elections are happening both at the national and regional level. So it's a big thing for Kenya. And you're also right in saying that during such times, most reform initiatives are put on hold. However, what is interesting for Kenya this time around is that the issue of corruption is actually an election agenda. And that by that I mean that one of the parties that is seeking to be elected, one of the coalitions, they call it Azimio, meaning that they've come together, is running with corruption as an issue. So that then means that for us in Kenya, the corruption issue is been profiled as an important issue because what has been recognized is that corruption in Kenya has been an existential threat to both the economy of the country and also the general security of the country, because we lose up to about 30% of our GDP to corruption every year. Therefore, the good thing is that the issue of corruption is now looking forward an opportunity. And we found that the politicians in planning their manifestos are putting it as one of their agenda items. And also in seeking running mates and partners, there's been an emphasis on seeking to have people on board who have a history of integrity, at least on one of the coalitions that's running, and a history of fighting against corruption. So this is an opportunity for us because actually, when we look at it, during the first year of the new government, there will be very little that will happen in terms of new initiatives, because by the nature of how our government runs is that the incoming government during the first year will run on the budget of the government that's just left government. Therefore, there will be very little wiggle room to make any much change in terms of budget planning and what have you. However, there will be opportunity to begin to put in anti-corruption measures, both within the private sector and also the public sector, which could create an opportunity to raise additional income for the incoming government. So yes, issues there's sense of slowdown in some of the policy issues being put out. But however, at the same time, there's opportunity for a renewal in the push with the incoming government. So I see it in those two perspectives. We are looking forward and hoping that the incoming government will profile this as a critical issue. That's what I would say to that, Laura.
That's actually quite good to hear. But just, tracking back to the former administration, if I recall correctly, corruption was also an agenda item in the campaign and all the discussions and the debates, right? So I'm curious, have you seen anything more that the current candidates who are running for the highest office that suggests that there is a stronger commitment to implementing some of the really, maybe not drastic, but really important reforms? I know this current administration is doing a lot around beneficial ownership transparency, but there are some other very pressing reforms that are very specific to like implementing the Bribery Act, police reforms, and some of the other ones that civil society is pushing for, right? And we saw that corruption was a major issue for the previous administration, but I don't think that we've seen much of traction in terms of how effective the reforms have been. So do you have cause to be optimistic that whoever wins the election this time around, they have like a very calculated plan to implement critical reforms like some of the ones that are still being debated, to work more closely with the private sector, to roll out more reforms in the procurement transparency space, for example? I like the idea that they're looking for folks who have a track record of integrity. That's a very important place to start. But are you seeing like policy plans or draft policy briefs that these campaigns are maybe discussing?
Great question. Where we are at in the election calendar, they are yet to release their manifestos. We are expecting their manifestos, their policies, their plans to come out in the next 1 month or so. However, you and I know that we do not lack laws. Kenya has not lacked laws. Laws have been passed. There are many laws that have been passed and many initiatives that have been passed. And I'll mention, for example, the Bribery Act that was passed by Parliament within the current government. We have seen initiatives. Apart from the law, we've seen initiatives by the judiciary to fast-track corruption cases. We've seen happening, public sector corruption being taken to court, and we have seen an increase in those cases being adjudicated. Therefore, we do not lack laws and policies. What we feel has been lacking, that continues to lack, is the political will to push through these reforms. And then also, we have also lacked the persons who will push for the rule of law. Now, if we had people in government who had the political will, who are willing to take the political hit to address issues of corruption, who are committed to the rule of law, we believe that the country would be in a very different place today, because the framework is in place. The framework to fight corruption is in place. The institutions are in place, whether it's the Ethics and Anti-Corruption Commission, whether it's the judiciary with the anti-corruption courts are in place. What I think has been lacking is the political will, number one, and then also the leaders who are willing to push that political will. Now, when we look at the caliber of people who are running for government, if there's one side that we have people who have had a history of fighting against corruption, who have fought against issues on corruption in their former life. We have one of the potential running mates, who has a strong track record of working with civil society on issues of corruption, who has always said that what Kenya needs the most is the rule of law. So I think with the coming election, what will send the right signals is if we get the right man or woman in office. Because we have the infrastructure in place, if we get a person that will let the systems run, the anti-corruption initiatives run, and give them the support, the budget, and the political will, we believe we'll be in a very different place in not too distant a future. So I think, yes, we've had them in place. However, we've not had the political will. Also, we've not had this other administrative support, such as budget support. And we believe that the kind of caliber of people who are potential candidates, if they do get into a seat of power, I think we will see that change. But that may also be work the other way around, that there are also other candidates who have been very, deeply entrenched in and of themselves, even in corruption. So it depends on how this election goes. But we do see some hope. We do see some opportunities depending on who finally are elected into office.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like to hear the optimism actually that you bring to this. And just shifting gears a little bit now to talk about, the private sector, the role of the private sector, what we might call enablers. The private sector has been accused for a few years now of, helping to bolster some sort of state capture in Kenya. Of course, the private sector has been involved in that in South Africa. So I just wonder, do you get the sense that since 2014, around 2016, since SAIP's been working with the private sector in Kenya to tackle corruption, do you feel that the private sector is better equipped to make corruption a priority agenda to be addressed either through advocacy or, as we've rightly observed, perhaps it's not a lack of laws and it's not a lack of amendment to current laws, but maybe through collective action, through new initiatives that would, make the current laws be more effective and better implemented? Do you get a sense that the private sector is at that place where they can, quote unquote, self-regulate, which is, which was the theme of the last Africa Business Ethics Conference, which I hope you talk a little bit about at some point as well?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yes. So SAIP in Kenya works with the private sector. We are well integrated into the private sector, working a lot with the business member organizations. And I must admit, we've come a long way. And what do I mean? We have had several initiatives at SAIP. One of the initiatives has been advocating for the passing of the Bribery Act and streamlining and mainstreaming of regulations and guidelines of the Act so as to bring that law into action. That has been one of the initiatives. We have also been involved in the building the capacity of private sector to firstly understand the fact that corruption hurts business, creating the awareness that corruption is a challenge for Kenya. Now, we come from a place where almost culturally, corruption has become part and parcel of the fiber of society. It's almost as though corruption makes business more successful. That is almost the attitude that we have. So what we've been able to do in the last couple of years is, first of all, make private sector aware that good ethics makes businesses more profitable. Beyond doing that, we've also gone ahead to build the capacity locally to enable businesses, put into place systems that enable them to have anti-corruption systems in place. We've been able to build that capacity. So we've seen that progress. In fact, we in 2019 did a corruption mapping and we interviewed over 1,200 businesses. And one of the things that it showed is that the awareness on corruption issues has grown from almost zero to almost 54%. There's been a rise in awareness of the Bribery Act. There's been a rise in awareness that of the consequences of corruption. And that survey showed that this is especially so the bigger the business, the more aware they have become of corruption. But it also brought to the fore the fact that the smaller the business, the more impacted are they by corruption. So we can extrapolate and say that our work has been impactful in, number one, pushing laws and policies. Secondly, creating awareness. And thirdly, building capacity of the private sector to establish systems within their organizations. I must admit, it's not enough. We are just scratching the surface. And that is why, as we look forward, there's much more work to be done. And that is why this work is a long-term engagement. And we believe that we should especially continue to do this work because we especially need to change the attitude of our people to realize that corruption costs on the long term and doing business with integrity is profitable. So those are some of the initiatives and those are some of the achievements that we've managed to do over the last 5 years or so.
Mm-hmm. And yes, I'm actually going to just ask you about some very specific examples and, maybe even stories that you might want to share on that point, because you made some very, very important points about what we've been able to achieve. And sort of in three steps. First of all, raising awareness. And earlier you were talking about, we don't have a shortage of laws, but the first base is people need to know what those laws are, and they need to know what then their obligations are based on those laws, right? Because if they don't know, then you might as well not have those laws. It's almost like policies in organizations that just sit on the books, but then don't get used or translated into procedures that employees apply. And then the first one you talk about is actually the advocacy, which is really exciting to hear about. And then the next part is the capacity building. But I have a question, about how we sort of create an environment that incentivizes, encourages, maybe reward is too far, but at least encourages businesses to comply or to not be corrupt, to do things differently when they are in a business environment where it is not expedient, it doesn't make business sense to not be corrupt. Just as you were saying earlier, we're in an environment where businesses almost benefit from knowing who to bribe, how to avoid, maybe not by bribing, but how to avoid following the letter, cutting corners. Businesses sort of find that more expedient. Unfortunately, because the public systems are not as efficient as they should be or not as transparent as they should be. And these things are not good for business. But in our work, in pushing for these laws that requires businesses to comply, even though sometimes it's not expedient for them to comply. Telling them about laws that they need to comply with when they think, wow, it's going to be expensive to comply with this new bribery act and this new beneficial ownership transparency requirements. And also building their capacity when we know in practice, this is going to maybe increase their burden of compliance. This is probably going to make them stand out as bad business for the possibly, public officials who might be demanding bribes for them. So how do we sort of work with our partners to create an environment where businesses actually see the benefit? It's not just a philosophical or an idea that is true in an ideal setting, but even in this transition to an ideal setting, we're trying to make sure that businesses see some benefit for doing things right. How are we doing that through our programs?
You are right. In terms of incentives to comply, that has been one of our challenges, because when you are with a business thinks about profitability. Anything that comes in the way of their profitability is not attractive to them. And therefore, how do we then begin to incentivize this? Some of the approaches that we've had is, for example, just making it relating their day-to-day business and helping them see how corruption impacts their day-to-day business, and helping them see that if they are to comply, how would it then make their businesses more profitable? I'll give you an example. We have a scenario whereby government officials, especially government officials in charge of licensing, work from office to office. And for any business that has not paid their license, they are forced to pay the government officer a small bribe. And therefore, as soon as the officer knows that you're not complied, they'll be at your door every other week. So what has been our message to small businesses especially? We've been trying to make the case, if you pay all your licenses on time without penalties, it has a direct impact of you not having to pay bribes, because eventually you will have to pay for that license at a premium. So that has been the kind of capacity building through a program that we have called, we've set up compliance clubs. That's been a very practical teaching whereby we tell them, if you renew all your licenses on time, the government official will have no incentive to come to your door and knock on the door and ask for that bribe, because you've paid all your licenses, unless they look for something else. That's been one initiative, and that is proved to be pretty practical, and they can see it. Now, some other initiatives that are now being birthed that we are now thinking about is that, for example, how can we make government procurement accessible to SMEs? And one of the initiatives that we are now beginning to birth is seeing whether we can engage government and through our Ethics First initiative, have government buy into our Ethics First initiative as SIPE. And Ethics First as an initiative is a platform that seeks to create a database of businesses that have complied And that database ensures that suppliers and have access to a broad market, large market of business or of partners. And the idea here is that what we are right now beginning to engage government on is, if you make ethics first one of your qualifications for people who are applying for government contracts, it's not a must, but it's a plus if you have it. Can that be a way to incentivize business to uptake on ethics first, and therefore making sure that you're getting businesses that are compliant, businesses that are compliant to government licenses, and that way incentivizing businesses to then take up anti-corruption measures and systems in their businesses. Those are sort of incentives that we are beginning to push. The other way to incentivize small businesses and other businesses in general is to show them the consequences of a lack of compliance. And that comes through in pushing for the operationalization, or rather the enactment and the bringing into action of the Bribery Act, and through the regulations and the guidelines. And because that law stipulates certain penalties for companies caught up in corruption. So we are telling them, if you comply, you will not be exposed to these sort of penalties that you may, even that your company will be exposed to if you do not comply. So those are the sort of initiatives that we are pushing for. Of course, still early days, but we are beginning to see some uptake, especially in terms of just simple compliance, resulting in cost savings that are brought about by not having to pay small bribes to government officials. So those are some of the initiatives. They have to be done continually. We are still in early days. This is a challenge that the country has had for a long time. We are just starting, and we have to keep plugging at it. So that's where we are. Those are some of the initiatives that we are undertaking.
Mm-hmm. Wow, Ben, we just have 5 minutes more, and there's so much more I want to ask you and talk about. But this is so interesting. The practicality of these programs, I'm very familiar with Ethics First, with the compliance clubs as well. Quite intriguing. I can see that the end goal is going to sort of create a business environment where there's a premium on integrity. Integrity actually has an equity to it that the government can benefit from by leveraging Ethics First to improve transparency and improve its procurement screening process. So that way, it's sure that the government is sure that, the SMEs that win procurement bids have sound governance systems, or at least are working to make sure that their governance systems are sound. They are not vulnerable to corruption at a very high risk level. This is really interesting. And then it also has the multiplier effect of encouraging other businesses to meet that standard as well. So that's great. And I'm so excited that Kenya is one of the pilot countries for Ethics First. But since we have just a few minutes, and you haven't talked about some of our other programs in Kenya around anti-corruption, like the Budget Transparency Project, perhaps some of the work that we've been doing with the Chambers of Excellence. I wonder if you want to talk a little bit about those before we wrap up this podcast.
Thank you. Probably I'll talk about two. I'll talk about our budget transparency work that we at the county, and then I'll also talk about our Africa Business Ethics Conference. So SAIP is working in 8 counties, and Kenya was devolved into 47 regions. And the devolution was meant to bring services closer to the people, so that, and with that, meant that budgets were also decentralized to regional governments. Now, since that happened in 2010, what we've realized is that there's been also an increase in corruption within the regions. Therefore, we say we also devolved corruption as we devolved governance. So what SAIP has done, what SAIP was therefore done in order to influence the allocation of budgets and also to track the use of money at the counties, we then have a program where we are working with these 8 chambers in these 8 regional governments, which we call counties in Kenya. And therefore, what we have done with these 8 chambers, we have connected them to one of our partners, a think tank called Institute of Public Finance. And what we are working with them, number one, to help them work with the county governments to make sure that budgets that are put out have gone through public participation in the decision of how budgets are made. But beyond that, also at the tail end of it, to make sure that those budgets have been utilized as they have been planned. So we do, for example, we had a review where we reviewed the agenda of the current government. They came up with what they call a Big Four agenda, where they focused on 4 sectors. They focused on health, on construction, on manufacturing, and the other one was agriculture, or food sustainability. And therefore, they had budgets that are earmarked for all of those. So we actually produced a report that showed that though government had the intent to use money in this, there was limited use of budgets in those sectors. Only one, probably the housing sector, attracting budgets. So we're able then to put government to account in its use of resources. So that's one of the programs that's ongoing, and we've been able to see a lot of chambers being able to influence how budgets are allocated, especially keeping in mind that Kenya is a micro and small enterprise economy. And therefore, decisions that are made affect our micro and small enterprises. And therefore, we have seen a lot of good things happening there. Secondly, another initiative that we are also running is that one of our partners came up with an idea to have a platform where businesses can come together, private sector, and discuss issues that affect business. And therefore, the African Business Ethics Conference was born. And since it was born, we have had 3 of those conferences. In 2019, we had it in Kenya, in 2020 in Nigeria, and we've just held another one in Kenya in 2021. The purpose of this is to create a platform where businesses can come together and discuss issues on corruption, and also engage government in a sort of like a public-private dialogue forum where we bring government to the table, we have private sector, and also we'll have civil society. And together, we discuss issues that affect private sector. The private sector also takes up initiatives that can be able to on an ongoing basis, address issues of corruption. So that's an initiative that has really gathered momentum. We've just come out of one, and the last one was to do with issues of private sector sort of managing itself and being able to call itself to account. And that is we're beginning to see results for that. So those are some of the initiatives, very interesting. We are seeing a trend of issues being articulated and being able to engage government on them. We had very good representation from government at the last one, and we believe it's an initiative that we're going to do in different countries in Africa. So those are some of the initiatives, and we believe that in the not too distant future, we'll begin to see those affecting positively reducing corruption in Kenya and in Africa, for that matter.
Wow, that's a fantastic note to end this podcast on. Clearly, we are very busy in Kenya. You indeed have your hands full, and it sounds like we are seeing some good results, but there's a lot more work to be done. So thank you so much for joining us on this podcast, Ben. We really appreciate your time. Next time, we look forward to having you and perhaps one of our partners in Kenya to also discuss in more detail some of the exciting outcomes that you talked about.
Thank you, Lola, for the opportunity, and also for Sai. Yep.
And thank you for listening.
Democracy That Delivers has been brought to you by the Center for International Private Enterprise. For more information, please visit sipe.org.